Ben Shapiro has been at the center of nearly every single major political debate and rap music cover for decades. And a few days ago, he made a video looking at Russia. For those who don't know, I am a history channel who researches Russia a lot, both in the past and the present. And I am in school, maybe too much school, on this topic. So today I'm going to be dipping my toe into the potentially political waters and address Ben Shapiro's newest facts episode on Russia. What does he get right? What does he get wrong? And would I consider his analysis a good one, despite his obvious political bent? But first, remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that fun stuff. For those who don't know, Ben Shapiro is an outspoken political conservative commentator. Recently, he started a series known as Facts, where he tackles various political topics in a 10-minute length video. In the 10th episode of Facts, Ben looks at Russia and sought to give a brief overview of the major challenges the country faces. While he doesn't say it explicitly, the video is probably geared towards the isolationist crowd, which is generally on the conservative side, and has some level of sympathy or apathy regarding Russia and the wider Ukraine war. The structure of this video he does, which I will link in the description, is around 10 minutes long and is split into 5 parts. First is about Russia's demographics crisis, and this is one of the more salient points that Ben makes. Fundamentally, Russia is declining due to a drop in population. As the nation's birth rate declines, its workforce for the coming decades shrinks and thus is less productive, while the costs of the society rise since it has to pay for an elderly group that is no longer in the labor force and is larger than the labor force. The economy is strained, and there is little room for growth for an entire generation. Since 1994, the Russian population has dropped by 6 million people. For comparison, the US rose by 92 million people in a similar time. Although, to be fair, a lot of that is immigration. In addition to having a shrinking population, the quality of life in Russia is significantly worse than other European countries or the United States. The average life expectancy in Russia is now only 64 years old, compared to 77 in the US, and rampant alcoholism and drug abuse have been staples of the country's ongoing chronic issues since the 1990s. Ben points out an Economist article that states that Russia lost 2 million people more than expected over the last 3 years due to the war, COVID, and the flight of many Russian men from the country to avoid mobilization. With this disproportionate loss of young men, there are at least 10 million more women than men in the country, which can have its own significant demographic issues and translate disproportionately to single motherhood. In general, Russia is in decline. Not only is its population starting to shrink, but its ability to actually produce economically, which we'll talk about in a minute, is also dropping. And due to this decline, Russia has had to act in a more radical way than it otherwise might have. The next topic that Ben talks about is Russia's economic crisis. Russia's recent economic history is actually kind of interesting. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the country was in a sort of death spiral. It was very chaotic and immediately privatized, and it was a time where most people lost pensions. And since the entire economy had previously been a planned one, there wasn't really a good organic way to develop business and free market infrastructure in the country, and in the chaos, a handful of oligarchs became exceptionally rich, unlike, say, Poland, which freed up more slowly. Through the 2000s under Vladimir Lenin, Russia really did begin to become a stronger and stronger rising economic power, with significant GDP growth about 7% a year through the early 2000s. Ben attributes this mostly to deregulation and lower taxes, and I'll be the first to admit I am not an economist, but many other factors were at play here, including the fact that the economy was essentially starting at a very low point and was able to make progress quickly as it approached its natural balancing. You see this with most developing countries, which tend to have very quick growth. It's not necessarily due to specific fiscal policies, but rather just the fact that developing economies grow faster. This was all made better by the fact that Russia had lots of oil and later on was also able to exploit its natural gas resources with the shale revolution, selling it and becoming a massive energy supplier for the world. Another thing Ben points out here is that by around 2004, Putin had started to re-centralize the energy sector in Russia, and he essentially co-opted the oligarchs. Rather than having an oligarchic class that was more or less independent and held sway within the country, Putin was able to control them and use them for his own purposes. This actually is an interesting contrast with Ukraine, which underwent a similar oligarchism process, but since the country is a democracy and never had a really centralized autocratic system, it was never fully to rein those oligarchs in. Russia's economy started to get bad in the 2008 financial crisis and got even worse after 2014 with its invasion of Crimea, where it started to be heavily sanctioned, which only doubled down in 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Generally speaking, Russia does have a high GDP of around $2 trillion, but a low GDP per capita of around $15,000 in 2022, meaning that's what the average person in Russia was making. In many international circle studies, a multiplication of a nation's GDP times its GDP per capita is a good way to gauge the nation's real power. Looking at this metric, we see that after we divide the final number by 100 million, just to kind of make the numbers more comprehensible, Russia is dwarfed by most of Europe. The US is far more powerful than anyone else with a score of over 19,000, and the next closest is China with around 2,200. Russia, meanwhile, is down at 342, more competitive with Korea or Spain than any of the great powers. Here I want to bring up a couple points that Ben either doesn't make or may go a little bit against his argument. The current sanctions regime against Russia have been relatively ineffective. The renewed war industry has grown the Russian economy by almost 5% despite all the sanctions, and unemployment is at an all-time low at 3%. Even its GDP per capita is up from around 12,000 in 2021 to over 15,000 by the next year. It's very likely that this is just a short-term stopgap measure and it can't hold, and it's possible the Russian economy may really collapse at some point, but for the time being that doesn't seem to be the case. Another point Ben doesn't talk about is actually about natural gas extraction. In order to do this, you actually need some more advanced technology, and most of that advanced technology is not something that Russia is actually able to produce itself. Most of that technology is actually imported from other countries, like Europe or the United States. With sanctions, it is actually getting harder and harder for Russia to extract natural gas, and it is actually becoming less and less of an energy power. Over time, of course, not in the immediate term. This, coupled with the decreasing population of Russia, is essentially creating an environment where the country is only going downhill from here over the coming decades. As such, if there are any goals the country needs to accomplish through military or economic power, it kinda has to do that now before it's too late and the country becomes too weak and too small to exert its will with hard power. This may actually be a significant reason why Russia decided to go into Ukraine now, and according to Peter Zehan, who is an economist, he actually predicted that the last year for Russia to feasibly invade Ukraine would be in 2022, and he made that prediction back in 2014. The third point Ben makes is about Russia's military crisis, which I think calling it crisis is a bit overstated. While you can point out that it isn't working as well as it could, fundamentally, the Russian way of war is very different from that of the West's. Since this is a history channel, I'll actually dive into the history here, and a key element of understanding Russia's historical development, not only its military but also economically and politically, is its geographic size. Russia is huge, the largest country in the world, and it has a massive population compared to the rest of Europe, even if most of that population is in the West. With this massive size, the Russian Tsars have historically favored a more autocratic style of rule, since a more federalized system would likely lead to division and loss of territory to neighbors and, of course, civil war. But to do anything on a national level at such a massive scale is really expensive. You want to urbanize, you need workers and goods to get in and out of the cities, which means you need massive rail lines on a level no other European country needs just to get off the ground. Want an army? They need to defend all of that land, which means you need a lot of people, which means you have to pay to train and equip all of those people. And you need to be able to move them around the country, which means you need more rails. And God forbid you want a navy. This ocean is frozen, these ports are totally at the mercy of the rest of Europe, and this is all the way in the Pacific. As such, Russia's military history has been defined by quantity over quality warfare, with little in the way of advanced tech and a small navy that is not mutually supportive. Let's look at some concrete examples. The Russian military wasn't actually technologically behind Europe until around the mid to late 1800s, since the status quo of musketeers had been around for centuries at that point. Russia actually performed relatively well against Napoleon, the Ottomans, and of course the Swedes. However, with the rapid change in technology in the 19th century, Russia couldn't adopt those new technologies at scale in the same way the proportionally richer and of course numerically smaller European nations could. Explosive artillery, rifles, machine guns, all of that totally changed European arsenals, and Russia took a long time to be able to afford those upgrades at scale. Through World War I and World War II even, many Russian troops weren't even given weapons. Instead, they were just expected to pick up the rifle of a fallen comrade on the field. It wasn't until Stalin's industrialization of the country in the 30s and 40s that a massive, full-scale modernization campaign could start during World War II, which eventually overwhelmed the Germans. The Cold War saw an interesting compromise of quantity and quality. Since Russia had a planned economy under the Soviet Union, it was able to put an unnatural amount of resources into a couple things, including the military. This partly resulted in some very good military technology, like the AK series and kind of the dual series of T-tanks that they have, or some MiG jets even. But generally, the economy wasn't strong enough to overcome Russia's size and inefficiency issue, and as such, its military capability hinged more so on its massive size than anything else. For example, by the 80s, the USSR had around 40,000 tanks by itself, compared to around 35,000 tanks in the entirety of NATO. In addition, the Cold War also sees Russia's development of nuclear weapons and the creation of a stable triad, which essentially makes it impossible for Russia to be fully conquered or destroyed or anything like that, at least from the outside. After the fall of the USSR, the Russian economy as well as its military diminished significantly. The massive Soviet-Russian military couldn't even pay to get its soldiers and equipment back from the other unions for years. The high-quantity approach proved to be just too expensive again, and through this period, Russia didn't even really need a conventional military. In Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and Crimea, the Russian forces needed to be able to deploy, but only on a smaller scale, usually within the region, and with their own support assets that didn't need to drag a massive apparatus into things. They learned this slowly and kind of the hard way. After Russia's disappointing 2008 war with Georgia, the Russian military began to reform in this western direction, adopting a more flexible battalion tactical group structure and investing in more advanced technology. It was with these reforms that the Russian military seemed to be at its peak and moving in the higher quality over quantity direction. But there were still issues. After 2012, Russia started to transition back to its older, more bloated division structures. However, the Russian military didn't actually expand in this new re-expansion. The idea here was that Russia actually had a massive reserves force in the country, since they had year-long mandatory conscriptions for the male population. In the event of a war, Russia could mobilize this massive, lightly trained force to actually fill the divisions, while the actual number of people ready to fight at any given time was much smaller. That's partly why Russia's invasion of Ukraine failed so badly at the start. The force sizes were actually much smaller than they were on paper, since the Russians didn't want to mobilize and lose the element of surprise. For example, many troop carriers in the invasion didn't actually have any troops in them and just had the crews to drive the vehicles. Today, Russia is transitioning further back into a quantity over quality direction, throwing untrained conscripts into the war in massive wave attacks. Most of the high-quality troops and tech that Russia used in the invasion was killed or lost, and as such, the remaining professional soldiers and high-tech weapons are not really used in the war that much. Future editing me here just wanted to caveat this and say that this is not always the case. Russia has started to decentralize command a bit and work in smaller probing groups, since Ukrainians won't waste artillery shells on only a couple of people. The Russians are learning and adapting in this war just like the Ukrainians are. Task and Purpose just came out with a good video on that, so I'll link that. Generally, Ben does get this right. I think framing the Russian military situation as a crisis is a bit much, but since Russia always sort of fights like this, now it's just kind of on a larger scale. Ben also talks about the potential timelines for the war and how Russia hopes to wait out the West, which most people agree is what they're doing. Ben also references the IISS report that says that Russia will be able to keep the fight up for another 2 to 3 years. But it's also worth noting that Russia is in a war economy now and is putting a lot of chips on the war economically. According to the Carnegie Endowment, 6% of Russia's 2024 budget is going to the military, and various Russian sectors involved in the war, namely navigation, electronics, transport, clothing, are up massively. While that 2 to 3 year estimate may be accurate, it's worth noting that this is also far longer than Ukraine can pull off without Western support. Next, Ben addresses the political situation in Russia, which is one of dictatorship. Perhaps surprisingly, Russia has hardly ever had democracy, only a heavily flawed version through the 90s and early 2000s. It has absorbed various democracies through its history, including the Novgorod Republic, the Zaporozhian Sich in modern Ukraine, and of course the Polish Constitutional Republic. But Moscow itself has always been an autocratic regime. I have 2 videos on Russo-Ukrainian history if you'd like to watch those here. Through the early 90s, there was a little bit of democracy, but even this was heavily flawed, as exemplified in 1993, when President Boris Yeltsin actually shelled the parliament building after they tried to impeach him for expanding his powers as president. He did win a second term democratically, albeit in a very corrupt manner, and in 1999 he replaced himself with Putin, who in 1999 was not democratically elected, he was just thrown in by Yeltsin. It's worth noting that under Putin, things did get a lot better in Russia, and he won a real electoral victory in 2004. Putin did temporarily step down as president in 2008, since the constitution prevented him from running more than 2 terms back-to-back, but this has been changed now, and Putin can stay as president for life. Since then, Putin has been heavily dictatorial, although some level of this existed before 2008 as well. Political opposition in Russia is severely restricted, and many dissidents, as Ben lists, have actually been killed, including recently Alexei Navalny, probably. Russia does not have a freedom of speech. As Ben acknowledges, there is actually a new law where people who criticize the war in Ukraine can actually have all of their property taken away by the state. While some quote-unquote opposition exists to Putin, it's worth noting that all of this opposition is just farther extreme than he is. This is likely a purposeful tact by Putin, essentially to show the world that there are, hey look, there's all these other crazier people than me, and if there are any attempts to like kill me or coup me or whatever, then a worse regime will follow. For all intents and purposes, Russia is a dictatorship with elections, including one that actually happens this month, which are really shams. Putin always wins by overwhelming majority, and as we said, any real opposition is purposely purged, either arrested or suppressed, or sometimes even just killed, or like fall out of a building. That seems to be really common lately. This is actually in contrast to Ukraine, which Ben doesn't really get into. Another point of note is that the Russians in general don't believe that democracy exists to the same degree. There's a decent interview of Nikolai Burlyayev, a member of the Russian Duma, where when asked if Russia is democratic, he says, "There is no democracy at your side," meaning the US, "at our side, Russia. The democracy is just a show. This is a fraud every time. Therefore, I think there is no democracy in this sense, and there cannot be because it is impossible." To be slightly fair as well, it is also worth noting Putin is actually popular. It's not like he still could win elections either way, but he's definitely rigging them as well. To be sure, Ukraine is absolutely a corrupt semi-oligarchic state. That's completely true. However, it is worth noting that this is still a democracy. Elections happen and leaders shift power peacefully in elections that are widely considered to be free and fair. There is actually a historic democratic governance in Ukraine, which is not present in Moscow, and this originates from the Cossacks. Again, I have that video, go check that out. Finally, Ben touches on Russia's aspirations, and he sums it up quite well when he says that Russia wants to be respected and seen as a great power in the world. This is absolutely true. It is a large part of why Russia does what it does. Stephen Kotkin, who is a famous Russian historian and a biographer of Stalin, has made the point that Russia is unique among other former powers and that it hasn't ever really gotten over the fact that it fell off, whereas places like England or France have more or less accepted that they are no longer a superpower in the same way that they used to be. Much of Russia's mythic history is based on this idea of it being a third Rome, not only a powerful empire, but also the home of true Christianity, a claim that has been weakened as the nation's religiosity declines along with its power. Today, Russia's religiosity is relatively low, due largely to the decades of atheistic Soviet rule. Despite what many people think, it's unlikely that Putin's real goal at the start of the Ukrainian invasion was to take over a bunch of Ukraine. Rather, it was more so to install a pro-Russian government that he could control. Much like America had a Monroe Doctrine in the 1800s, where America essentially called dibs on the entire Western Hemisphere and told European powers they couldn't interfere in those areas, Russia believes that Central Asia and Eastern Europe is essentially its playground to be a regional hegemon in. Ben acknowledges Russia also sees foreign affairs as a zero-sum game, and that they are generally far more militaristic and hostile towards other nations than, say, Western powers are. Russia is notoriously good at not necessarily military affairs always, but at a so-called hybrid warfare, wherein they are able to essentially more or less wage cold wars very effectively. They are able to degrade their opponent's ability to act in certain parts of the world, or want to act in certain parts of the world, with little if any military force, and mostly working through information warfare and espionage. It should be noted here as well that just because a lot of Russian stuff is psyops, that doesn't mean that anything pro-Russian is necessarily propaganda. A lot of people make it seem like that, but that can just be an excuse sometimes. Since Russia is more militant in how it acts and views the world, much of what it thinks of the West is actually kind of projection. When Russia sees mass protests happening in Ukraine against a pro-Russian politician, they perceive it as a ploy by the Western world to slowly degrade and destroy Russia, because that's exactly what Russia is trying to do with these other countries. So why does this matter, and why did Ben decide to touch on it? Well, obviously I can't read Ben's mind, as it turns out, but I'll give it my best shot as to why he may have thought that Russia was a salient subject, but it's also episode 10 of Facts, so maybe he was running out of ideas, I don't know. Given that Ben is a conservative, he has greater access to a conservative audience, obviously. However, many conservatives are more isolationist. Many figures on the right, such as Tucker Carlson, are big advocates of this, and Ben actually departs from many conservatives here because he is more hawkish and he does believe America should play a bigger role in the world. As such, there are actually many American conservatives who, maybe don't necessarily like Russia, but don't think America should support the war in Ukraine. And there are also many Americans who are more sympathetic to Russia, perhaps most well shown in Tucker Carlson's walking around Moscow, saying how great everything is in the subway and how low the prices are, and making Russia out to sort of be a somewhat wonderland, a move that many saw as kind of propagandistic. By making this video, Ben may have been hoping to try and undermine any Russian sympathy that conservative people in the US may have. Since he avoided explicitly talking about the war too much, I don't think he was necessarily trying to get people to support further American aid to Ukraine, but I think he at least was trying to make it very clear that Russia was the bad guy in this war, which is something that many people don't actually believe and see it as more or less of just a Bloods and Crips deal, and both sides are equally to blame for the fight. Overall, I think Ben did a pretty good job, and I was pleasantly surprised with his grasp of the subject. In general, Russia is a large but declining country that can't keep up with the West or with China. A failing population, weak economy, and a far weaker military than expected all contribute to this and don't bode well for Russia being a superpower or a valuable ally anytime soon. I think his point on demographics was very important, and it was really good to see that he has some comprehension of the deeper drivers of the conflict, aside from the more short-term triggers, such as questions of Ukraine joining NATO, for example. You can see some of his bias shining through, especially when he is more advocating for deregulation and lower taxes, talking about how that's why Russia became so economically powerful in the early 2000s. But overall, he tends to get it very right, and again, I think there are just a few things he missed that I hope I added in this video. Overall, though, I think he did a pretty good job. So that's it for this video, everyone. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that fun jazz. I hope you enjoyed. Remember to follow me on Twitter, X, and Instagram, and all that fun stuff. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.